Do you think this is a sellout move? Because here's a guy, he was the third party candidate, but remember also he wanted to run as a Democrat in the primary. I think it's fair to say the Democrats really did box him out. I've said a long time, many times here, that I think if RFK had a real shot at the primary, now it's different because Biden stayed in it, but I think if it was an open primary versus like the Shapiros and the Whitmers and the Newsoms of the world, there's a very good chance RFK Jr. with debates could have won that. I understand why he's so pissed at the Democrats and the party of his dad and his uncle for freezing him out. You can also say, hey, okay, if he aligns with Trump, if he really is somebody who wants to do good for the world, and in his opinion, if he could run the National Institutes of Health or whatever it is and have a cabinet position, if that's what he wants to do and he can make a difference that way by not being a president, I understand that line of thinking, but I don't know. To me, it feels a little sleazy. It feels sellout-ish to me. I like RFK Jr. I've said that. I don't know. I guess if you're going to drop out, you probably have to endorse someone. That's usually the way it goes. I don't know. It just kind of leaves me with like a lukewarm feeling about everything in his campaign.
Look, we've talked about RFK a lot on this podcast. I I have so many mixed feelings. Starting with this, I have a natural default to want more competition in politics.
Yeah.
So I want third party independent candidates. I would love ranked choice voting where we would have a chance to really open the door to more independent minded candidates. And so in general, I'm sympathetic to that. I also, as I've talked about, like RFK personally. But I mean, I think what's happened with RFK is what I predicted would happen all along for two reasons. Number one, third parties always fade. The only possible exception to that was Ross Perot in 1992. And even he faded because in the summer, there were polls where he was ahead in that year. And the reason they fade is obvious. We have a two-party system for a reason, right? Because it doesn't matter what percentage you get, it's do you win or not. And so people want their vote to count. Part of it, too, is RFK started getting more exposure. There were more profiles about him. People looked into his record more. John Oliver, I mean, look, I did a kind of a mini, I wouldn't say takedown. I did a mini fact check on him in our last podcast for 15 minutes or whatever it was. RFK people hate me. I'm not going to do that again. All I would say is go watch the John Oliver, Google John Oliver RFK Jr. He did a 30-minute takedown of RFK. Fact, again, I know the RFK people don't believe in fact checks. One of the fact checks, I can't remember if it was factcheck.org or PolitiFact, did are you ready for this? 3-part series on only his vaccine comments. And each part was lengthy. It was scrolling. I mean, the man has built this persona, which I think is mostly bullshit, on him being this truth teller, right? He's above the two-party system. He stands in this void where he's give me a break. That so again, and that's me saying this is someone who finds him interesting and smart and likable, right?
Well,
I think
hold
all
on,
those
real
things
quick.
can be true at the same time.
Real quick.
Yes.
He did want to run as a Democrat, though, to be fair.
He did.
He
He
did
did.
want to.
And he wanted to run as a Democrat, and the Democrats made it hard for him. I mean, let's be honest. That's what they did. And that's what political parties often do when you try to challenge an incumbent president. Hell, they sometimes do that even when there isn't an incumbent president. Ask Bernie Sanders about what happened to him in 2016 running against Hillary. But here's how you know the guy is not what he pretends to be. He reached out to the Harris campaign. That's the Washington Post saying this. Now I know the Kennedy people will say, "Well, I didn't hear that from Kennedy's lips. The only thing I can believe is what RFK Jr. tells me is true." Yeah, sure. Here's what the Washington Post story said. Okay, so the Washington Post publishes a story last week that RFK wanted a meeting with Harris, considering dropping out of the race, trying to position himself for some role in the future. Right. Here's a quote from Washington Post. After the initial publication of this story late Wednesday, this is last week, Kennedy and his campaign confirmed the outreach to Harris to other news organizations. On Thursday morning, however, he dismissed the idea of endorsing Harris in a social media post. I mean, come on. So he And so Harris rebuffs him. Now he goes to Trump. Apparently, look, maybe I want the caveat here because by the time you hear this, maybe he will have decided something different. And if he doesn't endorse Trump, I will come back and say good for him. Good for him for having integrity and for standing up for some type of principle. But if in the likely event he does endorse Trump, he reached out to Harris. You and I talked about the New Yorker piece where text messages, which to my knowledge, he has not denied. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed it. He's not denied that I've seen that in text messages, he called Trump a sociopath, barely human, among other things. And now it looks like, again, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I am. He's going to kiss the ring after being rebuffed by Harris. Like this is the defender of decency and honor and integrity. This is the man that he's a fraud. He's been a fraud. He remains a fraud, right? In many ways, by the way, that doesn't make him unique in politics. He's looking to, he's looking to get his beak wet, right? He wants to put
Yes.
himself in that position. That's what happens. My problem isn't even that he's doing all this. My problem is he portrayed himself to be something other than what he's doing now, right? Also, the other thing I wanted to talk about was what effect it will have. Because to me, that's, obviously the even more important thing is where do his voters go? When it was a Biden Trump race and he was getting 10% roughly nationally, it was pretty clear he was helping Trump. Biden was doing worse when RFK was included than he was head to head. That has changed. And it doesn't show up too much in the national polling. Like if you look at the national polling, Harris Trump, and then Harris with the big field with RFK and others, it's pretty similar. But in the swing states, Cook Political Report had swing state polling last week where Harris was leading, I think in 5 of the 7 swing states and tied in 1. The lead was small for the most part head to head versus Trump. But when you included RFK, she was gaining in a lot of those states 2, 3 points, which is a huge difference, right? It was the difference between her up 1 or 2 or her up 4 or 5. And Cook has come out and asked the RFK voters about who they would support in those swing states. 45% said Trump if RFK wasn't in, 26% said Harris. So that's a pretty big gap. And that's asking them without RFK dropping out and endorsing Trump. So you would assume if he doesn't just drop out, but he says, hey, this is the guy. To my supporters, if you like me, you need to put yourself with Trump. If he does that, which again, I expect him to, we'll see, I would think that number would go even higher. Now, look, it's 2 or 3% of the vote right now that he's getting in most of these states. It's not a lot, but like we talked about with Shapiro, if it's close, everything matters. And so just like not picking Shapiro, it may not matter at all, but it also may cost you the whole thing, right? That's the thing of a close election. And so I think that's really interesting. Also on RFK, I mean, in a way, I'm even kind of surprised that he even flirted with the Harris campaign at all. Like, because if you've been, we talked about this before, the media he goes on, the way he portrays himself. At one point earlier this year, downplaying January 6th, which he did. Look it up. He did. I'm sorry. We've heard it. He said it. Saying Biden was a bigger threat to democracy than, I don't know, the guy who for 2 months tried to overturn an election and summoned a mob to Washington, D.C., that then tried to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. The other guy is more of a threat to democracy. Like the conspiracy theories that he embraces, in many ways, this is who RFK is, right? So in that regard, it's a pretty natural fit that he and Donald Trump would go together. But it's just another one of these people, and most of them in the Republican Party, they know who Donald Trump is. I mean, we talked about the text messages from the New Yorker piece. Like RFK Jr. is not a stupid man. He knows who Donald Trump is, right? But what does he want? Power. And that has been the story of the Republican Party since Donald Trump, became the nominee and became the president. Is you basically had 2 choices. You either got the hell out of the party, you left or were kicked out. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Jeff Flake, others, Mitt
Mitt
Romney to
Romney.
some degree, or you bent the knee, right? That was it. Those were your two choices. Most of the people bending the knee, there are some true believers. Like I think Marjorie Taylor Greene is a true believer. I think Lauren Boebert, I'm not saying there aren't some true believers who actually think Trump is this, you know, generational figure who is this incredible person who will bring, do amazing things. But I think most of them, like the Mitch McConnells of the world, the Brian Kemps, the governor of Georgia, they know who he is. But they like power and they understand what you have to do to play the game. And again, I think that is weak. I don't think it's patriotic, but I understand it. And I wouldn't even be that upset about it if RFK Jr. hadn't been for what a year now portraying himself as something different. It's the hypocrisy to me of RFK more than what he probably will end up doing.
Yeah,
A-
I
And
agree with
and
that.
and rant.
I love it. No, I will say, and I've not been a Trump guy, but I did say I thought Trump was a pretty dang good president until January 6th. So I will push back and say there are some people though who don't love Trump and they just say, "You know what? I don't love everything he does. I think things were better." Even if you disagree, they might say, "Hey, I think things were better in foreign policy. I had more money. Now we don't have to get into why there's inflation, but you can understand and they can say, "Hey, I'm a conservative. I'm going to vote for the conservative." I get that. I understand that. But I agree with you on RFK specifically because if you go back a year or so, he was kind of the alternative media. He was the podcast guy along with Vivek. He was on every podcast. He was talking for an hour, 2 hours, and there were great conversations. I watched and listened to many of them. But even though he was at the time, he's trying to be a Democrat and see what happens. He did come across as kind of the disruptor, the third party guy, and I will say this, I don't think you can be as mad as him, like, let's say, choosing Trump over Harris based on if you want Trump to win or Harris to win. To me, it's more about, I think what was really exposed in the last 10 days or so, and here's where I agree with you, is that he's a politician. He's a politician like everybody else. And I don't hold any of these politicians on a high pedestal. I really don't. But at the end of the day, if you run this campaign where you do play both sides, by the way, like you brought up the whole thing about Biden being a bigger threat to democracy, and you're going to get comments on this because they'll always say, no. They'll say, RFK said, I could make the argument.
Yeah,
That's what
right.
he
I
said.
could
I
make the
could make the
argument.
argument that
Yeah.
Trump is not as big of a threat as Biden. But it was this whole playing both sides the whole
Yes.
time. So I guess it shouldn't surprise me as much that in the last 10 days, he is flirting with both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I will say, if he truly believes in service and he feels like he can still serve the country with how he looks at some of this medical freedom, okay, I think there is something there. I truly believe that he believes in these causes. But at the end of the day, if you did think he was the shining white knight who was
Right.
bigger than all of this swamp, he's still a Kennedy, right? And at the end of the day, if you're basically bartering for the best deal with the Democrats and the Republicans, he's pretty much just like everybody else. I think it's fair to
Yeah,
say.
he is. No, exactly. And you I'm glad you brought that up because it made me think of something else. You brought up the interview. I believe it was on CNN where he said, "I could make
Mhm.
the argument that Biden is
Yes.
the bigger threat to democracy." That is such a weak way to say it. But that is what and this is one of the critiques I have of RFK from a general perspective is when you are intelligent and you are articulate and he is both of those things, you can make anything sound good, right? And that's what he does. He makes conspiracy theories and some crazy ideas sound okay. And one of the ways he does it, which is smart rhetorical tactic, is he uses qualifiers like the Biden thing. And on vaccines, he is the expert at it. He'll say, "I'm not anti-vaccine," and then he'll launch a tirade. And again, just I'm not even going to get into it again. I know people don't believe political fact checks, but just I don't know, try it. Go to Google and go to PolitiFact and read part of the, again, 3-part series on his misrepresentation and lies about vaccines. Or if you don't want to read it, watch the 30-minute John Oliver show. He does an amazing job. But anyway, my point is, it would be like me coming on and be like, Charlie, I'm not anti-cheeseburger. And then I ripped cheeseburgers for 20. I've never eaten. I wouldn't eat one. They're not tested. I don't know. I think maybe the non-meat products are better. Have you see what they're doing with cows? But I'm not anti-cheeseburger. No, cheeseburgers can be fine. They can, and that's what he does. He starts with the, it's almost like a something to inoculate him when he says I'm, and that the RFK Jr. people, that's what they'll say. They'll be like, well, he said he's not anti-vaccine. Right, he did. He also said a litany of things about vaccine going back years that are either completely untrue or are devoid of any context or are misrepresenting the results of studies, right? So you can't just do that for, and again, this isn't a one-off where he said it once. You can't do that for years and even decades, and then come and say, "But I'm not anti-vaccine," and that like somehow inoculates you. I mean, it's ridiculous. But on the other point you made about voting for Trump, I want to be clear. I can totally understand how someone would vote for Donald Trump, even if they weren't a huge fan of his personality traits, shall we say, right? I mean, look, the reason this race is really close is because prices have, one of the reasons, prices have gone up 20% in the last 3 years. I mean, it wouldn't matter who the president or the challenger was. It wouldn't matter which party was in the White House and which one party was trying to take it. If the incumbent party presided over a time when prices went up by 20%, they would be in some trouble. I mean, that's just, no matter what else was happening in the world, that's just the reality of prices going up that quickly for Americans, right? It's one of the worst things that could happen to an incumbent presidential party. So we, you and I have talked about some of the context of that, but putting that aside, I understand that. What I'm talking about, though, are not the everyday voters who have seen their prices go up, or maybe wealthy people who want a tax cut, or people who are really, really concerned about the border and want something done with that. I totally get that. What I'm talking about specifically are people who are in the game, RFK Jr. and specifically Republicans in Congress, right? And specifically, I'm thinking the Republicans who were there and had to run and hide on January 6th of 2021 because a mob was coming chanting, hang Mike Pence. I'm thinking about Josh Hawley sprinting through the hall. We talked about him before of the Senate, right? That's who I'm thinking of. And then the same
Mhm.
people who come back and support this guy, knowing what they know. Having, most average voters have never met Donald Trump. They've not been in meetings with him. These people have. That's where I draw the distinction. I would never criticize voters making the decision based on their economic situation, the border, whatever issues they feel are important. That's every voter's right. I have respect for that. I'm talking about these people who know better and know what they know and have access to information that most of us don't, and decide to support this guy anyway. I think history will look back very, very unkindly on them.
All right, let's wrap it up. You RFK hater. Anything in your notebook? By the way, I just want to say I've said this 10,000 times, but I will say it again just in case we have a new viewer or listener. My thing on RFK is more big picture. It's not just really. It's not even about the COVID vaccine. It's about big pharma for profit medicine not looking out for people's best interest, the government. You can go back to OxyContin. With these companies are not liable. It makes sense for them to keep us sick, to keep us fat. We have all kinds of chronic disease issues in this country, and that I've said this 5,000 times. But with me, I think RFK is on to something big picture. And I've said a million times, I don't agree with everything, every vaccine thing he brings up, COVID vaccine, but I do think he's on to something big picture. That's my last qualifier before
No,
I could make the argument, Eric. I could
right.
make the argument